Good afternoon. Welcome to our roundtable on the historiography, Austrian History Made in the USA. I'm Michael Burri. I'm the editor of the Journal of Austrian-American History, and I teach at Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia, and I'm just finishing the second of my two-year term as president of the Austrian Studies Association. I have a panel that I'm looking forward to today. And I'll say a few words about the speakers. Our first speaker is Franz Fillafer. He is a historian of Europe and its global entanglements, whose research is so far focused on the Enlightenment. After positions in Cambridge, London, and Constance and Florence, he joined the Austrian Academy of Sciences in fall 2019. And he's going to give his talk on Habsburg and US history, connections and comparisons. Our second speaker to my right is Julia Bavouzet. She's a postdoc and historian at the Institute for Austrian Historical Research at the University of Vienna. And her dissertation on Hungarian Hochbeamten won the Hungarian PhD prize. She will speak on Americans and the other half of the Habsburg monarchy. To my left is Professor Christian Fleck. He's been a professor of sociology at the University of Graz. He's a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna, and he's been a frequent visitor and guest professor in the United States. And our fourth speaker is Pieter Judson. He holds a chair in 19th and 20th century history at the European University Institute in Florence. He's the author of several prize-winning books on Habsburg history, and he's actually a board member of the Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies. His topic is the transnational turn, and a group of inspired women scholars revive a field 1980 to 2020. And so our speakers are going to speak more or less on ways that individuals, institutions, and practices developed by scholars based in the U.S. have shaped writing and thinking about Austrian history. This is called a roundtable. And you might notice that this is not a round table. That's because the round table doesn't refer to this table, but rather to the room, which we see as a round table, and you're part of the round table. So we're counting on participation and questions after our speakers present. And our first is Franz Fillafer.
Right, so thank you so much for this fantastic invitation. Well, historians are rarely asked to recharge or reboot anything because their skill profile rather qualifies them for scrapping darling dogmas and cherished opinions. Now, but a fresh take on Austro-American relations is welcome, I think, and highly beneficial because it encourages us to reassess our perceptions of both regions by applying connective and comparative perspectives. Austro-American relations stretch back to the Habsburg monarchy and predate the Marshall Plan, forcing us to rethink the Cold War-inspired distinction between a superior, trailblazing and civic-minded West and a ramshackle, gridlocked East marked by nationalism and dysfunctional statehood, in our case, Central Europe. So there's a lot to be explored, I think, beyond Mark Twain's florid report from Vienna, where he watched the skirmishes and shenanigans of the Reichsrat in 1897, noting particularly the salty expletives the delegates hurled at each other, Haderlump being among the less offensive words used. In fact, a closer look at the Habsburg lands and the US reveals that both polities were connected by myriad ties of emulation, exchange, and cross-referencing. As Jonathan Singerton, a historian from Wales, now based in Innsbruck, has shown in his excellent new book, Habsburg subjects not only sought profitable trading relationships with the fledgling US, but eagerly engaged with American constitutionalism. America's federalist savoir-faire appealed to liberals of different stripes from Bohemia, Hungary, and Lombardy prior to as well as during the constitutional debates of 1848. Yet while Central Europe's citizens were not at all Amerika-müde, as the famous novel by Ferdinand Kürnberger implies, inhabitants of the US likewise took a keen interest in Habsburg Central Europe, not the least because this was a place where many of them came from. Let me just quote the case of Karel Jonáš, or Charles Jonas, at Madison, Czech national liberal turned Bourbon Democrat and lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, who used lessons from Habsburg Central Europe to attack US Republicans from the 1860s, chastising what he saw as their nativism and centralism. Jonas's example whets our appetite because it reveals the extent to which the Habsburg and the US polities were seen by contemporaries not as radically different, but as comparable macropolities, constitutional states with strong heads of state and powerful judiciaries that were faced with similar challenges when governing a patchwork of linguistic, legal, social, and religious diversity, and when seeking to calibrate growing regional segmentation. Just think of Roscoe Pound and Robert Ezra Park, whose legal and urban sociologies, as well as studies of marginalism in race relations, drew heavily on the works of Eugen Ehrlich at Czernowitz and Ludwig Gumplowicz at Graz, respectively. Now, these relational histories between the US and the Habsburg lands were removed from our sense of the past with almost surgical precision after 1918, when Central Europe's successor states reinvented the monarchy as a menace to world civilization and styled their peoples into victims of Habsburg colonialism. As Larry Wolff has shown in his recent impressive book, this chimed with Woodrow Wilson's self-image as a new Lincoln, as liberator of the enslaved inhabitants of multiracial empires. Wilson styled himself into a new Lincoln while busily segregating federal government at Washington and deriving his anxiety with heterogeneous states from elitist fears about, not the least, Central European mass immigration to the US. Think of Madison Grant's passing of the great race and his term cloaca gentium. When we then look into the interwar period, post-Habsburg Central Europe became a ground zero of a new international order, as historian Natasha Whitley recently said. And Nathan Marcus's work on state finances has impressively shown the function of Central Europe as a playground for new visions of world order. But the monarchy was, I think, turned inside out, providing templates for new supranational models of world making. Let me just mention one aspect, which has already briefly been alluded to by Federico Donofrio in his paper, namely the role the Carnegie and the Rockefeller Foundations played in sponsoring Ludwig von Mises and August Friedrich von Hayek's liberal world order. Funded by those foundations, Mises and Hayek, two orphans of the monarchy, one might say, conceptualized the world in the image of the late Habsburg state as a customs union that included underdeveloped outlet markets and permitted the free arbitraging of labor costs. Seeking to salvage what they viewed as salutary features of the monarchy, they envisaged a cosmopolitan regime of mobility that enabled assets, goods, and disenfranchised workforces to circulate freely while foiling economic protectionism, socialist welfare schemes, and mass democracy. So that's the first statement from my part, and I think we can pick up on those points in the final discussion.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation, which will give me the occasion to delve a little bit more in the other half of the Habsburg monarchy. And here I'm speaking about the Hungarian half, which was still very crucial for the Habsburg as a whole, because if we recall Robert Musil's word in the Man Without Qualities, the definition of an Austrian is an Austrian plus a Hungarian minus this Hungarian. So we still have to figure out what to do with these Hungarians. And I will talk a little bit more here about, well, this Habsburg Hungary in the American scholarship. So not Hungary as a whole, not this 1,000 years old Hungarian history, but really very much the Habsburg part, Habsburg centuries of Hungary. And while my questioning was quite general, it was if in the United States, the American scholarship, do we have an echo of this traditional division between Cis and Transleitania, which means that generally Austria and Cisleitania stands synecdochely for the whole Habsburg monarchy, and we tend to overview or a bit invisibilize the Hungarian part. And on the contrary, in the Hungarian scholarship, it's as if Hungary would stand alone for its 1,000 years old history. And Hungarian scholarships tend to forget a bit that couple of centuries were common with the other half of the monarchy. There are a couple of reasons for this mutual ignorance. At least in the 19th century, different legal and judiciary system. We don't forget about the fact that the Allgemeine Gesetzbuch, the civil code of 1811, wasn't implemented in the Hungarian kingdom, but only in the hereditary lands. There were different citizenships, different official languages, and these differences were only reinforced by the 1867 settlement, which led to a dual state construct. It's also interesting to note that within the Hungarian scholarship, we tend to replicate this division with the problematic position of Transylvania and Croatia within the Hungarian kingdom. So what I did here is a bit of a chronological overview of the Habsburg-Hungarian scholarship in the United States, which also allowed me to stress a bit more and to see the importance of the émigré scholars on the development of this field during the 20th century, even more than for more Austrian Habsburg history. So first of all, after the First World War and the imperial collapse, the Habsburg studies really grew for the first time as a field in American scholarship, which was very much oriented to diplomatic history, with a special relation to Slavic studies following the American interest at the Peace Conference. And we see here the first émigré scholar of Hungarian origin, Oskar Jászai, who with his major opus, The Dissolution of the Habsburg Monarchy, published in Chicago in 1929, was of paradigmatic importance. He provided an analysis of the autopsy of the Habsburg monarchy, analyzing the centrifugal forces before the First World War. And this book really was considered as the Old Testament of Habsburg studies in the American scholarship. The real blossoming, though, occurred after the Second World War, with a second generation of émigré scholars, and in parallel with the more recent development of the field in Austria itself, and a slightly change of focus, abandoning an anti-Habsburg perspective to emphasize some more democratic features of the late monarchy, especially dealing with the cohabitation of different nationalities. This was also connected to a first institutionalization of the field in the United States, with the publication starting in 1860 of the Historian History newsletter by John Hart, which became five years later the Austrian History Yearbook. But what about Hungary? And for Hungary, it was more after the revolution of '56 that we witnessed a second wave of immigration, some scholars making quite important career in the United States and Canada. And let me just briefly give you some name. Gábor Vermes, still quite important in Hungarian field today, who was at Rutgers, very famous for a biography of the Hungarian politician István Széchenyi, and more recently for a quite praised book about the Hungarian culture and politics in the Habsburg monarchy, which was actually an English translation of a Hungarian book published a couple of years earlier. We also have György Barany, who also participated in Austria to the major book collection, the Habsburger Monarchie, the second volume published in '75 about administration. And he's the one who wrote the chapter about Hungarian administration in the Habsburg Monarchy. Andrew János, also quite important compared to László Péter, who also immigrated in '56, but to London, and both of these scholars dealt with the failed democratization of Hungary. And here we have this Cold War narrative about Hungary and how somehow the way to modernization was a bit more problematic in the East, which led to the totalitarian regimes. Another quite interesting figure, Béla Király, who, like Vermes, actually wasn't a historian by formation, who was actually military officer by career, and it's just with more than 55 years that after a couple of adventures in the Second World War and as officer in the Red Army, emigrated after the revolution and went to Columbia University, where he held his PhD in history and taught military history at the Brooklyn College. And military history is also generally quite nationalist and studying a national army. So what is also interesting is that all these scholars that I named stayed quite aside from the renewal of American scholarship, especially in Habsburg studies, which is the birth and development of intellectual history. And here, of course, I think about the Austrian mind of William Judson and Fin siècle Vienna of Karl Schorske in the 70s, early 70s, 80s, which exemplified really this American school about Austrian history. And those Hungarians, while still traditionally remained in more political, constitutional history, economic history, and also with a great focus on the narrower Hungarian kingdom, which is still quite perceived as an autonomous entity or as an internal, administrative, political, constitutional problem of the monarchy, the Reichsproblem that Josef Redlich, the Austrian jurist, coined in 1920. So, as if Hungary didn't really take part in this Austrian state idea or mission, those Hungarians focus really on the Hungarian half, with the notable exception of Jászai, who dwelt with the Gesamtmonarchie perspective, and of course, more recently, István Deák, who before a couple of years in Paris and Germany, arrived in the United States in also 56, made a career at Columbia, and who really contributed to regenerate our perception of nationalism in Central Eastern Europe with his study of the Habsburg officer corps, entitled Beyond Nationalism, so a very programmatic title. So I will not extend much about the influence of the István Deák school, also because Peter Judson here made a panel about, participated in a panel about the topic a couple of months ago. But we have here emigre of Hungarian origins who really addressed the Habsburg monarchy as a whole. And of course, Peter Judson and John Deák, not related to István, are this younger generation who also contributed to reintegrate the Hungarian perspective, still emphasizing the fact that we lack of this overreaching perspective of the monarchy. What is also interesting is to see that the institutionalization of Hungarian studies in the United States and Canada occurred a bit later than the Austrian studies, and also that due to the segmentation of these areal studies in American scholarship, we have also repetition of this division between Austrian and Habsburg studies on the one hand and Hungarian studies on the other. Still, this division today tends to be overcome a bit by more bilateral cooperation between the American scholarly field and the Hungarian one after 89-91. For example, the Hungarian the Hungarian Studies Review that was edited by the Association for Hungarian Studies based in the United States and the Association of Hungarian Studies in Canada. This review was co-edited by the Hungarian National Library for at least a decade. And we also have bilateral cooperation with the creation of Institute for Hungarian Studies, for example, at the Rutgers University, directed by a new generation of non-émigré American scholars, so indigenous scholars. For example, Paul Annebrink, dealing with Hungary from the United States. And also, to close this rapid overview, I wanted to mention the Central European University as, at least until the past recent years, a good example of cooperation, funded in 1901 out of private foundation, with several campuses in Prague, Budapest, and later Warsaw, then who concentrated its activity in Budapest, in a very transnational intellectual environment, very much dealing with comparative perspective, though in a very good cooperation with the Hungarian colleagues at the Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. And it's quite symptomatical for today history writing, this international atmosphere, this broad circulation of scholars, especially at the beginning of their career, emphasizing English as academic language. This Central European University also witnesses this problematic political climate in today Hungary, with its expulsion from Budapest, or semi-expulsion from Budapest in 2018, and its subsequent relocation here in Vienna, dealing with an other, hopefully last wave of émigré scholars. So what I wanted to say here is very much émigré scholars from Hungarian origins dealt with and developed Hungarian studies in the United States, but also elsewhere. But is it still the case today? And don't we witness today this quite international epistemic community, this circulation of practices, methodologies, still connected with a very national network of institutes and universities, but really dealing on two levels, on the Hungarians based in Hungary and this international English-speaking epistemic community. And maybe David Pinkney's questioning at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association in 1980 about the difficulties of being an outsider is not so relevant anymore. He was asking, whereas can, I quote, Americans making their careers in the United States of Canada be significantly productive historians of modern Europe? And, well, today, of course, the question is easily answered by a yes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. So we have the two papers so far, and you might have noticed we're going in kind of chronological order, more or less, not geographical. And Professor Christian Fleck is next.
Yeah, thanks. I will talk about 4 or 5 cases, examples of Austrian history written, made in the US over the last 3/4 of the century. And finally, I will try to give some comparison between these cases. Let me start with a case from the margins of historiography and academic scholarship. After the Anschluss, several refugees arrived in the US safely, and some of them started thinking about their own past, thinking about the reasons of the defeat, the political defeat their political movements experienced, and finally they contributed some publications on this topic. I'm talking about these Austrian social democrats, socialists, a very tiny group assembling in New York, quarreling with each other, but finally producing some interesting pieces of self-reflection from the political left. One of them was Joseph Buttinger, I guess, but I will remain with the Austrian pronunciation, who produced a self-analysis of his own role in the illegal movement of the revolutionary socialists during the Austro-fascism. When he published this piece, his former political friends and comrades from the Socialist Party of Austria were not very happy with the content and tried to suppress the distribution of the book by selling all of them, more or less all of them, and hiding them somewhere in the cellars. It finally became reprinted and became one of the major contributions. The second example from the same political part, is from Alfred Braunthal, a graduate of the University of Vienna, who published in 1949 a small book with the title The Tragedy of Austria. And in this book there is a preface written by even more famous social democrat of these years, Friedrich Adler. The book has never been translated into German. It has never been recognized by the SPÖ because of its content. Friedrich Adler and Braunthal, and to a lesser degree Buttinger, were the first opponents of this first victim thesis. And they opposed this second part of the Moscow Declaration out of a political stand which you usually call Großdeutsch. But their argument was if the Austrians accept the role of the first victim, then they can escape easily from their own role in the rise of the Nazism. That's the first example. My second example is a little bit related to this first, because the Red Vienna got attraction even by American scholars before the Anschluss. And one of them was a man by the name Charles Gallig, who spent some time in Vienna on a Rockefeller Fellowship to study Austrian history, contemporary Austrian history, and he recruited one of the unemployed, brilliant young men sitting in coffee houses in Vienna, slightly related to this Institut für Konjunkturforschung we mentioned earlier. His name was Alexander Gerschenkron. He was born in Odessa, came as a young boy to Vienna, and flight to the US after the Anschluss. Rumor says that Gerschenkron was the real author of these famous 5 volumes of Gallig. At least he was a supporter and helping hand for Gallig. The 5 volumes never have been translated into German. A condensed 1-volume translation raised immediately the concern of the conservatives in Austria, and they commissioned an anti-Gallig volume, but that's another story. Very much related to this academization of historiography and thinking about Austrian past, you could mention another case, the Vienna-born Paul Neurath, the son of the famous Otto Neurath, a man of broad competences and impressive figure, spent after the Anschluss 1.5 years in 2 German concentration camps, Dachau and Buchenwald, was released and could escape to Sweden. And finally, he arrived in New York, and wrote his PhD in sociology, which has not been published until the 21st century for several reasons. The title of his PhD thesis was Social Life in Concentration Camps. This was a sociology PhD. It would be possible to do something similar today. It was not very easy to get the approval by the professors back then. But this is again an example of a more or less forgotten, unknown, ignored, sidelined contribution of writing Austrian history abroad. A much more mainstream contribution appeared later on. You mentioned it earlier, Karl Schorske's famous Vienna around 1900 became kind of the initial statement for a whole cultural industry celebrating Vienna. But one of the backgrounds of Schorske was his strong interest in psychoanalysis and Freudianism. And when Schorske published this book, Sigmund Freud was still a dead man in Vienna, unknown to anyone, not recognized at all. The building was there, but nothing else. Schorske's book became translated very quickly and influenced Austrian historians for a while. Some others were not so successful. So William Johnston, who has been mentioned with his Austrian Mind, I must say an impressive book for a young man from abroad. There are a lot of errors in it and things you can correct, but when he published it, there was nothing on the scenery, so he could not compete with someone, but he raised the standards. Let me mention a third example. Peter Gay wrote one of the most impressive Sigmund Freud biographies. As far as I remember, it has not been translated into German, but it's highly recommended. Again, Peter Gay, Peter Fröhlich, born in Berlin, became interested in Freudianism, and therefore he researched Freud. And these mainstream academic contributions are of, if you could call books role models, then they are role models for academic research. Finally, it's also of some interest that authors of Austrian background produced in the US contributions to the history of scientific disciplines. The most famous one is Josef Schumpeter, who wasn't a refugee. He got an appointment at Harvard in 1931 on a regular basis. Published, he didn't publish it because it became published after his death by his widow. This famous History of Economic Thought, which is an encyclopedia of economic thought from the ancient periods up to the 1930s, and it's still a landmark. There is a second Austrian economist by the name of Karl Schriebram, not so well known abroad. He also published a two-volume book on the history of economic thought. Both books became finally translated into German, and both are available. Another academic, in this case kind of a refugee scholar, Paul Lazarsfeld, did not contribute much to the writing of the history of sociological research or sociology in Austria, but he produced in the 1960s 2 lengthy reports on Austria when he was commissioned by the Ford Foundation to help establishing this Institut für höhere Studien, as it is well known in Vienna, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and both reports are telling with regard to the post-war circumstances of academic research and politics in Austria. So these are examples of academic research, mainstream research, institutional reports. How did they come into life? As I mentioned, these social democrats, socialists, were private scholars with no funding, no support beyond the public library in Manhattan, I would guess. Schumpeter was located in Harvard with the Widener Library, so very well supported intellectually and also financially. The later mainstream scholars produced their contributions in leading research universities. So can we say something for the future out of these cases? I would say we cannot evade political self-reflections published in book-length manuscripts from former politicians in the near future. So this is gone. We cannot expect refugee students producing PhDs on their past prison experiences, because as back in Columbia in 1943, today professors won't accept these kind of research because of lack of documentation, troubles with the sampling, and all the other stuff social scientists would raise. These histories of disciplines, the history of economic thought or social thought, is now more or less well established, but it's nowadays done on a much smaller scale. So encyclopedic volumes written by one author are not to be expected in the near future. That's not possible any longer. Will mainstream research universities produce comparable books to Johnston's, Schorske's, and Peter Gay's? I do have my doubts, because present-day academia is much more narrow-minded than it has been in the past. People are needed to produce their second book more streamlined, and definitely there is no interest in present-day Austria abroad, as far as I can see. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you so much, Michael, for organizing this panel and giving us the concepts to work with. And thank you, Julia. I'm so happy to still belong to a younger generation, at least for someone. But then I have to immediately contradict this, because as you were talking about this list of impressive Hungarian historians, I was remembering how many of them I met at István Derek's apartment in New York. So I am a little bit older. I'm in a unique position myself, although I think there are others here who share this position. I've spent most of my life studying Habsburg Austria from the United States, perhaps as an outsider. Now I train PhD students from all over Europe and the world at the European Union's only common university. And I have the luxury of having trained historians of Austria on both sides of the Atlantic, and it is a luxury. Speaking of the future, I'm going to start backwards. Let me start my presentation with a plea to anyone in this room who may possibly have some influence over government funding here in Austria. I often worry that those Austrians who are in charge of government funding forget that nowadays one of their most important exports to the rest of the world are the resources that their trained historians, women and men like Franz, who work at the Austrian Academy of the Sciences, who produce critical editions of documents and source handbooks on the Habsburg Empire. Historians from Tokyo to Chicago rely heavily on these resources. Who else in the world, if not the Austrians, will produce these resources for the rest of us? Where else is there the specialized knowledge of the documents and the Brandakten located, if not in Austria? And yet, their funding is constantly threatened and constantly being cut in favor of projects that, in my historian's view, could probably be accomplished anywhere in the world and by scholars anywhere. We scholars rely on Austria and the Austrians for our ability to make our critical histories visible to the public. And I think we try to do some public relations work for Austria as well, and we do it with great pleasure. We're privileged to be able to work here. But I do wish that Austria could treasure the women and men whose work makes our work possible. And I wish that Austria's political class could better understand and value these global contributions to their country's great reputation. If we want to think about recharging Austrian-United States relations, I think there is no better place to look than to the work of historians in the past 2 decades. This is not simply about the writing they've done. This is about material and digital presence as well. I am sure that the archivists at the Staatsarchiv or the Haushofen Staatsarchiv would confirm my guess that the number of American scholars they have had to help in the past decades has actually grown, and perhaps grown considerably. And I have no doubt that the digitalized newspapers of the Nationalbibliothek, not to mention the digitized and material resources published by the Austrian Academy of the Sciences, have also experienced high traffic from the United States. And finally, I observe that when I entered the field back in 1980, it was as a lonely and relatively isolated individual in the United States. Now, I can't escape the crowds of younger Habsburg historians at conferences in the United States of America. And for that, I am profoundly grateful, because at least I got a social life. Now, I hope this is interesting to you as an observation. It may even be surprising to you. But I haven't yet explained why I think there is this explosion of interest in Imperial Austria and its history in the past decades. One might turn to the frequent assertion heard over here that current interest in the Habsburg monarchy relates to renewed interest in the problems and challenges facing the multinational European Union. And this is absolutely true in Europe. I hear from people all the time who are interested in the future of the EU and want to know if I, a historian, can give them any advice based on what I know about the Habsburg monarchy. I can't. But I know this is a big concern here. But I don't believe this is a force that motivates more young historians in the United States to take up the history of the Habsburg monarchy. For that phenomenon, I blame some other trends in our field. The Shorsky effect has already been mentioned. That is, the interest in seeing Vienna and other cities of Habsburg Central Europe as laboratories of European modernity and modernism, and including the rise of populist nationalism. But the Shorsky effect is old. I mean, I remember it, but it's over. Beyond the Shorsky effect, there has been a bigger sea change in general history writing that influenced almost every field, and that is the turn to what we call transnational history. This transnational history involves the recognition that we must overcome the boundaries set for us by national and nationalist history writing to pursue subjects that cross national borders. And this could be anything from natural phenomena like rivers, to infrastructure like railways, to economic instruments, to informal colonial ventures that involve people from Austria, to cultural movements, religious histories, scientific investigations, to wars and regimes of occupation. And that's just a short list. For a very long time, our profession, and it's not surprising if you think of the original task of our profession has been organized into national fields, strictly delineated from each other. And the move to transnational history sought to overcome those problematic national boundaries. And it turned out, are we surprised, that Imperial Austria was the perfect site for transnational investigations. In fact, there can be no history of Habsburg Central Europe without transnational approaches and without transnational cooperations. Historians have been working very hard to undo the work of 1918, when the imperial archives and libraries were divided up among the successor states, according to the principle that each nation should have its own history. This trend in history writing now is not easy, especially for United States Americans. For example, it means learning even more languages for research purposes in a time when support for language learning in the United States of America is waning, and that's putting it nicely. But it also has led to international cooperation and engagement that, ironically, places Habsburg Austria or Austria-Hungary at the very center of all the interesting questions of history. You want a transnational dissertation topic that will tell us something broad and important about all of Europe? Just go to the Habsburg monarchy. Now, this may be surprising to some of you, but I've witnessed it in the United States. This interest in transnational approaches coincided with an interest in removing nationalism and the nation from the central place that they had occupied in European history of the past 2 centuries. Nationalism, responsible for so much violence in the 20th century, was presumed to be rooted in deep popular feelings of nationhood. But already in the 1980s and 1990s, many historians based in the United States began to question that presumption. Many historians here also did, but I'm talking about the ones in the United States. One of those historians, who's already been mentioned, Hungarian refugee István Deák, published a study in 1986 appropriately titled Beyond Nationalism. It's already been mentioned, and it's still a classic. Deák taught generations of graduate students at Columbia University, including myself, many of whom, including myself, shared his extreme skepticism about the central role of nationhood, or the central role that nationhood allegedly played in everyday life in Habsburg Central Europe. Other historians in the United States, like Gary Cohen or John Boyer at Chicago, who also trained many students, including the John Deák, who is not related to István Deák, also shared this skepticism and sought to raise other kinds of questions that did not put nationhood at the center of the investigation. And they engaged with historians here, and I especially want to mention Professor Gerald Storz and his many students. My point goes beyond the work of these foundational historians, because when I look back at the last 25 years, I'm astonished by the number of United States American historians who made Habsburg Central Europe the object of their investigations and who were not trained by professors like Deák, Boyer, or Cohen. Instead, these historians found their own way to this field somehow, and they wrote influential studies, and in doing so, they have changed the field both in the United States and I also think here in Austria as well. And today I want to briefly mention 3 US American women scholars whose work now stands at the center of debates about Habsburg Central Europe. These 3 women are Deborah Cohen, the historian of science who teaches at Yale University, Alison Frank Johnson, historian at Harvard University, and Tara Zara, historian at the University of Chicago. Now, none of these historians, whose work is so important, none of them studied with one of these influential historians of Austria. Each had to make her own way into the field, studying with professors who had other specialties. And each of these women continues today to contribute original arguments that shape how we, on both sides of the Atlantic, look at the history of this region. In her 3 books, Deborah Cohen has argued that the natural sciences developed particular kinds of methodologies in the Habsburg monarchy that rested on an acceptance and a recognition of diversity and variation. And these methodologies, in turn, produced big scientific theories that differed from the scientific theories produced in Europe's nation states. And Cohen's last book, called Climate in Motion, A History of the Environment and Climate Sciences, that book argues that Austrian climatologists and meteorologists developed radically different ways of understanding a global climate. Alison Frank Johnson explored the early oil industry in Galicia. Some of you may have forgotten that the Habsburg monarchy was the 3rd highest producer of oil in 1910, and it was all in Galicia. And she explored the oil industry to argue that the Habsburg state had not colonized its periphery, as has been traditionally believed, but rather that the local elites in the periphery, Galicia, had themselves shaped the oil industry and its disastrous environmental effects. She's also explored the global history of the Austrian Lloyd. In her first book, Tara Zara most famously introduced the world to the concept of national indifference, creating a conceptual way out of the traditional nationalist approach to history and disproving many comfortable nationalist myths. Her work then extended to histories of migration, and in a few months, her new book on deglobalization in Habsburg Central Europe will be published. Let me end by saying that what I've mentioned here is merely the tip of an enormous iceberg. A growing number of young and mid-career scholars from the United States whose work engages the history of Austria and the region, shaping the ways that we understand it today. And they have done this in dialogue with their Austrian counterparts. And they have certainly recharged interest among the broader United States academic community in a field that used to be considered too specialized and not terribly relevant to anything. When you say Austrian or Habsburg history today in the United States, you conjure innovation, creativity, and global relevance. Thank you.
Good. We have some time for questions from the audience, and we have a microphone to help with that. And so I'll open it to the group, to my round table, and
Yeah, Markus Schweiger, Marshallplan Foundation. May I add one book, the biography of Ludwig von Mises? He also wrote about the situation in Austria, so that may also fit in your list of contributions from the US.
The list of my examples was not exhaustive. There is not, yeah.
Thank you. Emil Briggs, Diplomatic Academy. I'm thanking especially Peter Judson for what he said, how much it has changed over the last 20, 30 years, and how there is a new generation of people interested in the innovative facts of the Habsburg history and how this is transnational. My general question is, when Schorske was successful, what was the reason why he was successful in America? Had it to do with the closing of the American mind and his liberal stance working against this? And if this is true, what is the reason why now Habsburg history is so successful in the United States? So to what is it reacting? Is it reacting again to a closing of the American mind, would you say? And my second question is a bit difficult to ask, really. The invention of Austrian history in the 20th century had, as we heard, on the one side, had to do with emigrants working in these various fields, but most of those emigrants were Jewish. So what is the influence? What has been the influence of whatever you call it, the Jewish mind or the ideas, the cosmopolitan ideas on this bringing Austrian history back to Austria, and does it still play a role nowadays?
I think that the Schorske craze, in a way, had various solvents. I think one particular interest at that time, at least I'm not a Zeitzeuge, but one aspect I think was the great interest, I think already present in the US, for instance, in the music of Gustav Mahler. And I think this was fueled by Leonard Bernstein, for instance, in the US, and this created a very receptive audience, I think, for studies of eine Säkle Vienna, which is interesting to see because, of course, Bernstein also repatriated Mahler to Austria in a way. If you look at these wonderful rehearsal sessions with Vienna Philharmonic, where he's a negotiator, where he's a kind of cultural broker, repatriating Mahler to the very grumpy and obstreperous Viennese Philharmonic players. But the other thing I think which kind of struck a nerve in Schorske's case is probably the rise of mass democracy and the problems of democracy in a kind of in a novel frame. And this is something which resonated with American anxieties. Although, of course, the Schorske thesis about this kind of slightly desiccated, over-optimistic liberalism was precisely demoted by David Cohen, who stressed the probabilistic way of reasoning in Austrian liberalism and not the parricidal nature of the probabilists revolting against their liberal fathers. So these are potential prompts. So one last word, Schorske, of course, was not trained as an Austrian historian. He was trained as a kind of modern historian, working on German social democrats previously, and then finding Vienna as a showcase, a perfect showcase for the trends of modernism he wanted to explore.
If I could add to what Franz says, I think the question of Schorske's success, we have to remember that the success here would have been based on different reasons than the success in the United States. I agree with everything Franz said, but I would add, besides this liberal anxiety, I would add the idea that a historian was attempting a more interdisciplinary kind of history, and one that dealt with the arts, architecture, music, politics, which now I think we all are interested in and would even hope to practice, but back then it was quite distinctive, and I think that was another reason. Then, of course, the famous museum exhibitions, and then, of course, tourism as it all develops. But another part of your question that I wanted to mention is I think that the Habsburg monarchy today is perhaps in the United States a bit misunderstood, but in a useful way, in terms of a multicultural society. As an example of one. And when we had the craze about, for example, history of borderlands back in the 90s, we all looked to the Habsburg monarchy for that. So I think there's a lot of things that Americans, like myself, see in their own country that can be investigated in a different way here. So I would also use that as another explanation.
Yeah, to the second question. There is at least one answer available as a book under the direction of Gerald Holton, historian of science at Harvard. He, together with Gerhard Sonnert, investigated the Kindertransporte generation, those refugees who came to the US with nothing besides their survival. And they compared this group of immigrants with other groups from the American society, American-born Jews of the same age group, different other groups. And the surprising result is this Kindertransporte generation was the most successful group in this comparison. And Holton then tries to find an answer and switches to an explanation, to a theory, more a theory than explanation, provided by Pierre Bourdieu, which is surprising because Holton is not a French theory guy. But this idea of cultural capital provides one of the answers. It's not a sufficient answer, but at least on the empirical side, it's clear that the Central European refugees were astonishingly successful after they settled in the US. It would be interesting to compare these Kindertransporte American with the Kindertransporte to the UK or to other parts of the world and see whether there have been some institutional factors supporting the success stories in the US in the 40s, 50s, and 60s compared to the UK, for example. This hasn't been done. It would be possible to do.
Yep.
Harald Steindl, historian in legal history. What's the influence of the so-called 48ers? Not only on the culture, for example, Kossuth was a main hero, and or Hecker later on, or the famous Austrian Heinrich Bernstein, who founded opera houses and a lot of fun. And if you look at the Gilded Age in St. Louis, you see not only German newspapers, German opera houses, German operettes. At the World Exhibition in St. Louis, you know, Karl Komschak, the famous Austrian dirigent, played a lot of influence. And what did they influence the universities at that time? For example, historians wrote a lot of books about the German influence on the American culture. All this ended in 1917, as you know. But if you, for example, read Weber's book on his visit to America, you see there was a German place, and German and Austria was totally in a combined maybe example for some local governments like Wisconsin.
I thought, I mentioned this guy, Karel Jonas, or Charles Jonas, in Wisconsin, the later governor-lieutenant of Wisconsin. And of course, there's very much to be said about that. Although I think that the institutional aspect of the ramifications of the Alt-48er remains to be explored. But what I found so striking is that there is an interesting paradoxical constellation in transnationalism, as every so often. Kossuth, for instance, the kind of swashbuckling Hungarian hero, was no federalist in the American mold, but he was more interested in centralism, and he actually vanquished the fans of the US in the Hungarian discussion of 1848. But he was then celebrated in the US as the big hero and the first foreign person ever to address both chambers of Congress and namesake of the biggest county in Iowa and so forth. So it's an interesting refraction, really, of the Kossuth myth. But I think that these 48ers are a very sizable population, and particularly also the Czech 48ers. Dvorak goes also to Iowa in 1893 to cure bouts of homesickness, to mingle with the Czechs in Iowa. And many of them are actually refugees from 48. So there is something to be said about Habsburg 48ers in the global mold. I think would be a nice topic to pursue for the future.
I would just add, I agree with Franz fully that the influence of the 1848ers is enormous, but I wouldn't say that it's enormous on the development of the universities. I'm just saying, the universities, certainly the graduate institutions are modeled on a Central European model, absolutely. But when I think of the breadth of the 1848 influence, think of settlements in Mexico and colonization, fighting in the Civil War, but also wars against indigenous people in Latin America, and just in all kinds of cultural ways, and of course German as the second language of the United States. I would just see it as a huge influence extending to all walks of life.
Youssef Cassis. I know very little about the subject, but still I was struck by something on the panel. The three first presentations were clearly about Austrian history done in America by Austrian and Hungarian. And then we had Peter, who spoke about Austrian history done by a new generation of, I understand, American historians, with maybe some links with us. So is it due to the background of the speakers? It could be, although I'm in doubt about Julia's background. I wanted to ask her. Is it due to, or is it a chronological change that more or less in the 90s, early 2000s, something changed? Well, you explained what changed. Is the wave now, that's how I understand it, primarily linked to this new transnational history, which, like all new trend, has a peak and then tend to decrease? Is it going to be linked to inevitable, not disappearance, but slight decline in favor of another trend which is going to come? How, and finally, maybe it's a bit harder to answer, how does this trend, how did this sort of new wave of interest for the Habsburg history compare with other possible? Maybe for the early modern period, the Ottoman Empire could be an interesting case, but of course there are always less interest in less people, not less interest, but less people. So I don't know. That's just a few questions which crossed my mind for a total outsider to the topic.
Christian?
Just one remark. I did not talk about Austrians when I mentioned particular individuals and authors, because it's not easy to identify someone as an Austrian who went abroad and remained in another country afterwards. And if you refer to their self-identification, so this Friedrich Adler would call himself a German. born in Austria with an Austrian background, yeah, but he decided voluntarily not to return to post-war Austria because of this reason. And Schumpeter went out of Austria in 1925, so he spent the next 7 years in Bonn.
But first generation doesn't matter at all. If you're first generation, you're second, third, or fourth.
Since I did some research on these refugee scholars from Central Europe, there is a huge group you should call double citizens, Austrian and Germans, yeah, who spent part of their careers, part of their life in Germany, part of their life in Austria, went back and forth between these two countries. It does not make sense to claim them for one of these two sides. And this Peter Gay I mentioned, he was much more interested in Austrian history than in German history, besides being born in Berlin and lived there up to 1938. But he was definitely not an Austrian. But what he published on Schnitzler is very impressive and helpful to understand Austria and Austrian literature.
Youssef, I think you are correct that my analysis that argues that more people work on the Habsburg monarchy because of the topic rather than because of where their ancestors are from means also that topics will change. And I think we can only hope that there'll be other fields that develop that will also focus on this part of the world, since it's the most interesting part. We can only hope that. But I do think, if you look at the big names, and we didn't mention, for example, Hans Kohn, but I think if you look at the big names in the field, they are emigre historians until we get to as late as the 70s and 80s. I mean, you can find other people who worked in the field, but the big names, am I right? I mean, I think...
Yeah, at least for Hungarian history, it's also the same, though maybe the difference with the Habsburg or Austrian field is that we still lack some Americans today. So the younger generation dealing with just a Hungarian topic is still a bit more reduced than dealing with the Habsburg monarchy, because Hungary is a national history, and this is about transnationalism. And also to reveal some mystery, yes, I have also some Hungarian background, so you were perfectly right about your assumptions.
Could take one more question if we have it.
One more
Bricks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really about the Wittgenstein research, which was also brought back partly from the United States by the American philosopher Alan Janik, who now lives in Austria. And his book, Wittgenstein's Vienna, is, as we know, more about the innovative character of Vienna 1900 than about Wittgenstein. So they brought back both the innovative idea of creativity in Vienna 1900 and Ludwig Wittgenstein, which is both something one should mention in such a panel. It's not a question.
Okay, but most of the Wittgenstein research is done in the UK and not in the US.
Yes, absolutely, and partly, fortunately, also in Austria, in Vienna.
Okay. All right, we're just on time. We're at the end of our first day. And I pronounce it a successful day, thanks to this group and our earlier groups and our speakers. Thank you, Franz, Julia, Professor Fleck, and Peter. We'll reconvene tomorrow with Arts and Culture, Kitsch and Death Revisited at 10 a.m. And I'm looking forward to that. And to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.